Hello everyone and welcome back to the Little Quilter. Today we are going to be reviewing the Red Sampler quilt. So this is a quilt that I have been working on for a long time. The quilt behind me is just a portion of the entire quilt. So it is called the Ruby Sampler Quilt. It was released by Connecting Threads as a block of the month quilt along for about a year. There were 12 months of the quilt along. The designer was Kristen Gassaway. It was a Connecting Threads exclusive. The fabric, let me look here. The fabric was the Hometown Americana Redwork Traditions collection. Quite the mouthful. So, and that was created by Connecting Threads as well. So basically, this whole quilt was designed through connectingthreads.com, which they sell lots of quilt kits and thread and lots of other things. But I saw this red and white sampler quilt in one of their magazines that they send me and immediately thought of a family member who really loves red and white just in general. A lot of their house has red and white in it. And so I decided to join the quilt along. It took me more than a year to finish quilting this. I was also doing the Barnstar sampler quilt at the same time, so I would kind of alternate between working on them. And then I decided to focus all of my attention on the Barnstar quilt and finish it, and then progress to the Red Sampler quilt. So my quilt ended up being finished at around 100 inches by 100 inches square, and I think overall it turned out really, really nicely. So a few things that I wanted to talk to you guys about. I like to review my quilts. I've done a couple of other reviews. I'll link those down below if you're interested in seeing some of the other quilts, just to give you guys an idea of what I think about the quilt, what I would do differently, what are things that I didn't like, or things that I learned during quilting it. So let's get started. So let's first talk about the design of the quilt. So I went through and started with designing this block right here. So the Irish chain block that is a repeating block throughout this quilt. And I decided that this was going to be my sort of mainstay in this quilt. And I wanted it to be a repeating block that didn't change. So every block looked like it. And I ended up doing more of just like a windmill pattern. And again, every block in this quilt, I have a video on how I actually quilted it with the design and everything, so you're welcome to check those videos out. But I decided to keep that the mainstay. The biggest thing that I did with the design of this quilt is actually to do with the background, and I can obviously show you guys a close-up of it as well. But the background, I decided to do that as a consistent design. So not changing it up block per block, because normally what I would have done is said that this is a block right here and I'm going to quilt this block differently as a sampler, and then for the next block I would do it completely different. And that's what I did with the Barnstar quilt. So my challenge to myself with this one was to do a consistent background throughout the whole thing. Now, I think that a consistent background in this instance worked really, really well, and I was very happy with the turnout of it. However, I don't think that would have worked well for the Barnstar quilt. And the reason for that is that the background kind of varied, and it would have made it different. It would have made it difficult to decide what was background and what was part of your block. So for something like this where you have a consistent background, whether it is white, black, tan, whatever it may be, I would consider doing this. I would not consider doing this with the Harry Potter quilt, another quilt that I did, because again, the background is so not consistent. And I just think that trying to make yourself quilt that would be really, really difficult. Other than the all over quilt design, the other thing I did was a lot of my designs within each of these separate blocks here are a lot more, these designs are a lot more ruler work. So a lot of all the background was free motion, but each block design was a lot more ruler work. And so I tried to use that consistent technique of, if something's really swirly, right next to it I'm going to put straight lines, and that gives a little bit of a difference between those, and you don't just get that meshing of swirls next to swirls, which doesn't give it a defined separate entity, right? So I really think that that's important, that if you're going to do an all over background, my other recommendation would be to make sure whatever you quilt right adjacent to it is going to be different, so that it is going to be more straight lined, or point to point, something along those lines that's going to be able to sort of differentiate the two. And I know Angela Walters does that a lot, where she will alternate between. Now, this is not to say that you can't do swirls within each of these designs. I definitely did. I have certain areas, but it was not typically right next to it. So example on this block being that I do have some feathers in these, but all of this is more of a grid line cross hatching design, and then in the center I have more of a flower design here. Okay, so I do have some swirls in there, but I'm trying to also include a little bit more straight line roller work quilting with it as well. Okay, so the big thing that I wanted to talk about here was this border design. This border design here, this almost like heart pattern or leaf pattern, whatever you want to call it, is, I think, my favorite border design. And I think giving these two columns and defining that space even further helped it, rather than making these really large. I do think that these look good at this size, and that's not to say that they won't look good if you make them bigger, but for me, I think this really worked well for this space right here. I then followed it with the shell pattern here, and I just ended up choosing that because it's a weird shape, and I wanted to kind of mirror some of the swirling that I had in here, but I didn't want to go full on swirl technique like I have here. I just thought that would be too much. I always feel like my borders need to be a little bit more airy and not as densely quilted. And I think that that's just because they're borders, right? My main focus is going to be the body of the quilt, not the borders. So if your body of your quilt is really densely quilted, I think your borders should be a little bit more light, just so that they can focus on where they're supposed to, but it also gives your eye a place to rest as well. The next step here in this border, and this one actually changed throughout the quilting process. So if you actually go back and look at when I first started quilting this, I did not have these lines right through here. I just had this diamond block and then this outward border, and I had left all of this blank. A lot of you guys were very concerned about this and were worried, that it was going to look wrinkly or it was just not quite right. And while I liked the blankness of it, I also felt like it looked a little off, because the rest of the quilt was so densely quilted that this being that open was almost too open. And so thinking about all of the things and looking at all of you guys' ideas and suggestions on what I should put in here, I came up with this design. And really it was a mixture of two. I can't remember who the ones that commented, but a lot of people were like, oh, you should do just horizontal lines there. And I liked that, but I also felt like it was just too empty. And somebody mentioned that they really liked this design and I should put this design in there. So I kind of meshed the two together and ended up with this design. And I at first hated it. I did like maybe, a foot of it and thought I'm going to have to rip all of this out. But it was late when I did that, and so I left it. And when I came back and re-looked at it, I was like, I think this might actually be okay. I think this might work. I just need to do a little bit more and really look at it. And now I'm so happy that I included this in the quilt design. I think that it really sort of helps to mesh these two borders together and make them look similar. It almost is like the little flower petals are going into the quilt and running to this vine here that's going around the quilt. So I just think it really helps to make it cohesive, which is nice. And again, you can see as I had mentioned previously. So in this block right here, we have all of that background quilting, which is so dense. And then here I went way more straight line quilting just to give it that little bit of difference and a place for the eye to rest, that if you're looking at all of this and then you get here, it's a little bit of a rest. I also feel like it makes it kind of look like it was stamped onto this fabric. Like this was your big white sheet of paper and you just have this stamped on there, which is really a cool effect, I feel like. So as you guys know, if you watched my videos, then you know that this quilt took me 24 hours to quilt, which is a long time. Now, it obviously wasn't consistent. It was over several months that I did this, where I would work on a few blocks, stop, do some sewing, do some other projects, and come back to it, because it was a very intense block. Now, I would say by the time that I got pretty well into this, doing the background was really, really easy to do. I got just really, my practicing of it over and over again really helped with my hand-eye coordination for this. And so if there is a quilt design that you are wanting to master or that you really like, but maybe you're nervous about, I would just recommend using it as a background for your quilt. And by the end of it, you will have mastered it. You will be so good at it, because I feel very confident with this design, and I feel very confident with, you know, getting into an area where I'm stuck and knowing how to get out of it without having any issues at all. So speaking of thread and time, and because I feel like you can get a good view of the thread here, this thread is called Cotton Candy. It is by Glide. I use Glide thread on the top of my machine, as well as I used Glide Cotton Candy on the bottom of my machine. And so you can see that I do have a red background here, and so the white thread definitely sticks out a little bit more when you're looking at it, but I have found that matching your top and bottom thread are going to be one of the easiest things to help you not stress over it. I went for a cotton candy, so it's a really light pink color. You can see it a little bit more on the white thread, and sometimes on these really darker places on the quilt, it does stand out a little bit more. But I was okay with that. So this quilt, while I am going to be giving it away to a family member, I purchased it knowing that I wanted to do some really dense, fun, heavy quilting on it. And that was my main project with this, was to try something new and to really quilt it. So I'm okay with the fact that somebody is getting this, that maybe they're not going to love the quilting as much, or maybe they're not going to, you know, really, they're not a quilter, so they may not appreciate it as much as some quilters would, but I love it, and that was my focus for this piece, you know. And I feel like every time you get down and sit at a quilting machine, it is a piece of artwork that you are creating, and you have an idea in your head for that piece of artwork, and this is what I was wanting. So I really like the pink thread. I think that that's a great color choice, and I knew I didn't want to change thread back and forth from like a red to a white. I just knew that it would drive me insane. So I think a light pink color for a red and white quilt is a really great option, and don't be afraid if you have a really dark background, because at the end of the day, I feel like you can only worry about one side of your quilt. Now, speaking of that, I save my little Magna Glide bobbins, and I am going to send them back because you can recycle them. So you can recycle them. But the other reason I save these is with my King Quilter 2 Elite, I need to oil my machine every 2 bobbins. And so because they are magnetic, I like to stick them on my machine as I go, so that helps me to remember when it is time for me to oil my machine, and I don't forget to do that, because I do think it's very important to take care of these machines. They're expensive. We're using them really heavily with a project like this, so you don't want to mess it up. The other thing is, it's just really interesting to know how many you've used. And so for this one, let me see. So for this quilt, I used 29 bobbins. And I know some of you out there would say, oh my gosh, I could hand wind my bobbins and not pay as much as I did for my bobbins. But I had zero bird nesting on this quilt. I quilted for 24 hours and I had no bird's nests. And I never touched the tension on my machine. Um, I may have tweaked it once on the very top, but I never touched the bottom line or the bobbin tension. And it took such a small amount of time for me to change bobbins that I am really stuck with using Magna Glides because of the ease of it, and the lack of frustration is just so amazing. It makes quilting so much more fun. Okay, and the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the size of this quilt. So, like I said, this quilt is 100 by 100 inches, so it is a really large quilt. And doing this vertical border here was very difficult. And so, what I ended up doing so that I didn't have to start and stop on this is I ended up quilting the entire quilt and just basically ignoring this, but like stitching my sides down so that they were flat and weren't going to wiggle around or get bunched up. And then once I finished the whole quilt, I just took it off and flipped it so that I could go through and quilt the top and the bottom again. And that way it just made it easier for me to quilt these without having that starting and stopping. So if you have a really large quilt and you're struggling with doing the borders, I would definitely recommend doing that. It was still kind of a pain, and I would also, one thing I didn't do when I changed that is I left a lot of my quilt batting attached that honestly I didn't need. I was going to cut it off anyways as soon as I pulled it off the loom, so I don't know why I left it anyway, so I would definitely recommend cutting off all of that extra batting. For some reason, I was just afraid to cut it off, which really doesn't make sense because I literally took it off and then just cut it off right after that. So it would have been fine for me to cut it off. So don't do what I did and cut your extra batting off so that when you're working with this, you're not dealing with that random, 5 feet of fluff just kind of floating around there. So I don't have a ton of cons for this quilt. I will tell you it is not perfect. There are definitely places that I messed up, but especially because this quilt is so densely quilted, it is really difficult to find those when you're just looking at them. If you want to get down with a magnifying comb and like go through every block, you will find the areas where, maybe my stitches weren't as straight or I forgot that I was going in the left direction, I went in the right direction, whatever it may be. But don't be afraid to do a really large quilt, especially if you have a quilting frame. And that is one of the reasons that I wanted to get the King Quilter 2 Elite, is because I wanted to do large quilts like this. This would have been terrible. And in fact, putting the binding on this quilt made me realize how much I love my quilting frame because I hated binding this. It was so difficult. And part of that difficulty came because it was so densely quilted. This thing is heavy. This thing is definitely a bed quilt. It is not made for lugging around the house because this quilting has just really packed it down and made it such a heavy quilt. It'll be great for the bed and it'll look really nicely, I think, because the fabric will just pull it down. It'll hang down on the side really nicely, but it's not one that I would drag around. So from the standpoint of if you're doing a quilt for a kid or you're doing a quilt for somebody that wants to, put it on their lap or move it around the house, I would not quilt it as densely as this because this thing is heavy, so heavy. And some of it is the size, it's 100 by 100 inches of fabric, but also the amount of quilting that is on here really just packed it down. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this journey with me. It has been quite a long one, and I am just so happy that it is done now, and I've actually got it bound. So that part is good. It's not one of these that I finished and then haven't bound. This quilt is completely done and ready to go to its new owner. As always, I hope you guys have a great day. Please remember to subscribe, like, give a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave them down below. And as always, I'll see you next time on The Little Quilter. Thanks.